are the IBECC Consulting Group, and we are here to advise you, the Google Board of Directors, on how Google should program its self-driving car software to react in the event of an accident. You may have heard about the trolley problem, a classic moral exercise used in ethical discourse. A trolley races down a track toward 5 helpless people who are tied to the track. If you had the power to pull a switch, sending the trolley instead down a track with only 1 helpless person tied to it, would you? This question has been hotly debated for over 50 years, and yet there has never been one single right answer determined. This is not only because it is nearly impossible to determine the value of an individual's life, or who deserves to die over another, but it is also extremely unsettling to think that we have that responsibility. This is the challenge that Google is being faced with today. As we will explain, self-driving cars will be incredibly safe in comparison to regular cars, but reducing the probability of an accident to 0 is impossible. In accidents that occur today, drivers make split-second decisions based on instinct alone. But due to the nature of a self-driving car, these decisions must now be pre-programmed. How should the car be designed to react? Should the car be programmed to minimize casualties? Should the car be programmed to prioritize vulnerable groups of society, such as children or the elderly? Should the car be programmed to protect its passengers? These are the alternatives. Oh, thank you. Though Google's problem is slightly more complex than the traditional trolley problem, it still incites the same debate over the valuation of lives. Due to the impending entrance to the market of self-driving cars, Google must choose a framework for its self-driving cars to abide by in the event of an accident. We are here to offer our recommendation to you, the Google Board of Directors, based not only on your need to maximize shareholder value, but also to maximize the value for all stakeholders associated with this revolutionary product. Today we will give you an overview of the progress of self-driving cars and the benefits that will be realized once they are fully developed. We will walk you through a scenario that will illustrate Google's challenge, followed by our recommendation for how Google should program its self-driving cars to realize the totality of benefits. Finally, we will give an explanation of the ethical, legal, and business implications of our choice. And we will now begin with an explanation of the traffic safety crisis at hand.
The purpose of the self-driving car is not just to innovate for innovation's sake. Road traffic accidents are the #1 killer of people under the age of 25 worldwide. We rally around other causes, yet the severity of traffic accidents continues to fly under the radar. In the US, 93% of all accidents are caused by human error. Taking your eye off the road for a second, speeding, driving while tired or impaired. So what would the implications be if we could remove the human from the driving process, eliminating human error? Today, there are over 5.5 million accidents in the US every year, causing over 23,000 fatalities, hundreds of billions of dollars of damage, and countless hours wasted in traffic. The self-driving car, as you know, stands to remove the human from the driving process, eliminating this human error. In the process, it stands to save over 20,000 lives in the US alone every year, generate over $400 billion in comprehensive economic savings, and increase road capacity by up to 300%, making us a much more productive society. Let's just visualize what it would mean to take 93% of accidents off the road today. Imagine that each one of these cars represents 25,000 accidents in the US every single year. Now imagine that following the introduction of the self-driving car, we are able to eliminate the 93% of these accidents that are caused by human error. As you can see, self-driving cars stand to not only incrementally improve safety for today's drivers and pedestrians, but to improve their safety by an order of magnitude. So how close are we to this vision becoming a reality?
There are 5 distinct levels of autonomy as laid out by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Today, we are between levels 1 and 2 of autonomy, with some cars able to perform specific functions autonomously, such as parallel parking and emergency braking. But in order to realize the full totality of the benefits that self-driving cars can provide to society, we must reach level 4. For the purposes of today's case, we are assuming that Google is building a fully fledged level 4 autonomous vehicle. And because our problem is not a technical one, but an ethical, business, and legal challenge, we have set forth several assumptions to isolate our dilemma. Our first assumption is that the car's decision-making capacity is flawless. It cannot suffer from technological failure and is impervious to hacking or interference. Secondly, as we mentioned before, the car is entirely autonomous, which means that it is free from passenger intervention while it is in operation. There's no steering wheel, there's no manual brake. This means that any accident that a self-driving car is involved in comes as the result of external causes and circumstances, rendering its passengers entirely blameless. To be clear, we are not arguing whether or not Google should pursue the self-driving car project. Our final assumption is that the massive potential benefit that self-driving cars bring to society will ensure its entrance into the market. Instead, we are here to advise Google on how this car should react in the rare remaining instance of an unavoidable accident by embedding an ethical framework in its software.
We've devised a scenario that will allow us to analyze and evaluate the different possible frameworks that could be programmed into the self-driving car in the event of an unavoidable accident. Let's imagine that a woman is traveling home in her self-driving car, which is depicted by the car in red. There is a group of 3 adult pedestrians to the right and 3 children to the left. A car is right behind the woman's self-driving car and is driven by a man who is in a traditional vehicle. All of a sudden, 3 bicyclists emerge into the intersection from behind a truck traveling through a red light. The first framework would seek to minimize casualties and would therefore seek to save the groups with the greatest number of travelers, which would in this case be the children to the right, the pedestrians on the right, and the bicyclist in front. In this scenario, the car would brake abruptly, resulting in injury to not only the self-driving car passenger, but most likely to the driver behind the car as well. This would, while it would base its decision on the number of lives saved, it would also be targeting the self-driving vehicle as well as the car, which are blameless. A framework that prioritizes vulnerable groups would seek to minimize damage to society's most vulnerable or innocent parties, such as women, pregnant women, the elderly, or children. In this instance, the 3 children on the left would be saved, and the car would do anything in its capacity to not hit the children. The passenger-first framework would seek to do anything in its power to save the traveler in the self-driving car. Is this framework, however, self-centered? In our analysis, we had to take an approach that we had to, as we can see through the scenario, it is increasingly difficult to decide on a framework on a case-by-case basis. In order to make a decision, therefore, we had to ensure that we could take a big picture approach in order to minimize the amount of social good in society in the long term. Therefore, we decided that the framework that would be the right choice to take on the part of Google would be one that would maximize market adoptability, and therefore, as a result, increase the safety on the road and dramatically decrease the number of accidents per year. Going back to the scenario now, imagine that both of the cars in the picture are self-driving. The car in the back would be able to sense the decision of the first car, and therefore the accident would be avoided and human error would be eliminated, which means that it would cause greater benefit in the proliferation of self-driving cars. Therefore, our recommendation is that the passenger-first framework is the framework that will lead to the greatest market adoption. It is not only the most marketable framework, but also the most ethically and legally sound framework, as you will see in our further analysis.
We'll begin our analysis looking through an ethical lens. In order to understand the crux of our ethical argument, we must first explain the difference between two common variations in utilitarianism. Utilitarianism states that the most ethical society is the one that produces the most utility or social good. Both act and rule utilitarianism seek to achieve this end, but they do so through different means. An act utilitarian would evaluate the consequences of an individual event and determine whether the actions taken in that specific instance maximize utility. On the other hand, a rule utilitarian would evaluate the rules that govern our actions and decide whether, if applied universally, these rules maximize welfare for society as a whole, even if they don't on a specific case-by-case basis. An example of this would be in today how we decide how to drive safely. An act utilitarian would say, always drive carefully, but would ultimately leave it up to the individual to decide whether the actions they are taking are deemed careful enough. For example, a person may drink 2 or 3 drinks at a bar and decide that they are safe to drive home, and they may be correct. In this case, in this specific instance, they would be maximizing utility, maximizing their personal utility without taking anything away from society. But for others, 2 drinks may be too many. A rule utilitarian philosophy generates clear, specific rules which, when followed, maximize social good for society as a whole, such as always follow the speed limit, always stop at a red light, never drink and drive. Using the previous example of somebody who decides to have a drink and then drive home, a rule utilitarian would evaluate the statement, it is okay to consume 2 or 3 alcoholic beverages and then drive, and they would try and apply this to society to see if it would maximize welfare. Very quickly, we would understand that this statement does not maximize utility for society as a whole, and so a rule utilitarian would reject this statement as a rule. In the same vein, just as our individual assumptions about how we drive carefully may differ, so our individual definitions on what it means to maximize utility may also lay on a spectrum. Because of this, Google does not have the right to calculate on a case-by-case basis which action maximizes utility. And as a result, we expressly reject the framework that minimizes casualties as a whole, because this does, on a case-by-case basis, try to calculate which action would maximize utility. Instead, our recommendation, the passenger-first framework, follows a rule utilitarian principle. Because of the vast societal benefits to be reaped by society with the introduction of self-driving cars, we argue that the most marketable framework, the framework which encourages the most market penetration, is the most ethical framework because it will ultimately generate the most utility for society. When Google protects its passengers first, under a passenger-first framework, it makes the intimidating concept of having no control in a car palatable to a mass market, which you'll see in our business analysis. And as a result, a passenger-first framework is the most marketable framework, which in turn makes it the most ethical framework.
I will be discussing the legal dimension of Google's decision. As a successful thought leader across industries, Google holds trust from the market, the public, and legislation. Google is the leader of the Open Automotive Alliance, which is made up of all major car manufacturers. These manufacturers will collaborate to communicate the importance of this technology to lawmakers. Furthermore, Google has successfully lobbied state governments to allow for the testing of its self-driving cars on public roads, demonstrating Google's power in today's legal environment. Those state representatives who were able to test drive Google's vehicles were quickly convinced of their superior driving capabilities and political appeal. Florida Senator Jeff Brandes was quoted saying that he feels like it is a better driver than we are. California State Senator Alex Padilla was quoted saying that this has bipartisan appeal. Industry experts predict that legislation will make room for self-driving cars based on the value they provide for society, with Google's technology leading the way. But once autonomous vehicles become legal and the car is in control, under a passenger-first framework, a passenger cannot be held liable for the actions a car takes in the event of an accident. A passenger is completely innocent and free from blame. Liability thus falls on the decision makers, Google and other producers of self-driving cars. With this shift in liability, the self-driving industry seemingly becomes unattractive and high risk. However, we can expel this liability barrier. Some of you may recall the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. In the 70s and early 80s, a string of lawsuits against vaccine makers caused dozens of companies to leave the low-profit business, creating a public health scare. This law created a buffer against litigation risk, minimizing the liability of vaccine makers and encouraging companies to promote the common good. Don Howard, the director of the Riley Center for Science, Technology, and Values at Notre Dame, draws a link between the positive outcomes of producing vaccines and those of producing self-driving cars. He says, if the human toll from highway accidents were a disease and we knew there was a cure, it would be immoral not to marshal every corner of government and industry to deploy it. Because self-driving cars offer the same greater benefit to society as vaccines, industry analysts expect a similar legal shield, a protection in the form of a National Autonomous Vehicle Injury Act. Even with the shift of liability from the car owner to the car manufacturer, the self-driving car industry remains legal, attractive, and low risk.
The business case for self-driving cars revolves around determining which framework is the most marketable to the mass market. As these headlines indicate, there is an enormous market opportunity predicted for self-driving cars. Luke's research estimates that by 2030, the market opportunity associated with self-driving vehicles will reach $87 billion in profits, with $30 billion of this alone for software developers. Also, a BCG study estimates that by 2035, the autonomous vehicle sales will reach $77 billion, with 14 million autonomous vehicles sold. In addition to the growth of the current market, the addition of new market segments will further expand market opportunity. Self-driving cars have the capacity to increase access to and decrease the cost of mobility for the world's 40 million blind, 1 billion disabled, and over 100 million people over the age of 80. This aged cohort alone is expected to increase fourfold over the next 2 decades. In addition, the market opportunity for self-driving cars will only increase as consumers find new uses for the cars that could not be achieved with traditional vehicles. So how does the passenger-first framework help Google tap into the self-driving car market? The number one issue facing self-driving cars today is the perception that self-driving cars are dangerous, with people being afraid to give up control of the wheel. People would like to believe that they are better drivers than computers, despite all evidence to the contrary. In reality, self-driving cars are much, much safer for everyone in society, given their ability to take the human error out of the driving process. But it is these perceptions that are vitally important when introducing a brand new product to the global market. And studies from BCG, Auto Trader Magazine, and Insurance.com indicate that safety is the single biggest concern for the general public regarding self-driving cars. Currently, 52% of consumers say that they believe that self-driving cars would be unsafe for their own passengers, with a quarter of respondents saying that they would never purchase a self-driving car. So if safety is the biggest barrier for self-driving cars, a passenger-first framework has the capacity to change perceptions. A passenger-first framework would be the safest framework for the potential consumers of self-driving cars. While all potential frameworks would dramatically reduce the likelihood of getting into an accident in the first place, only a passenger-first framework can ensure consumers that in the extremely rare event of an unavoidable accident scenario, the car would do anything in its power to protect its blameless passengers. Once self-driving cars operating under a passenger-first framework hit the road, we believe that most consumer doubt will be assuaged. As Nathaniel Fairfield, a technical lead for Google, stated at the Embedded Vision Summit, Google's research has shown that we quickly learn to trust autonomous vehicles. Humans are lazy. We quickly go from plausible suspicion to wayward confidence.
In conclusion, we believe that the Google Board of Directors should adopt our recommendation for a passenger-first framework in the event of an unavoidable accident. To review our assumptions, the self-driving car will have perfect technology, which means it will not break down and will be impervious to hackers. It will also be entirely autonomous, which means that it will be able to achieve level 4 of autonomy with absolutely no input from the passenger, which means that the person or people in the car are absolutely blameless as well. In order for our vision to come true of a world made safer by self-driving cars, it is important for there to be mass market appeal and proliferation of self-driving cars. We believe that the passenger-first framework, while we can't solve the trolley problem, we believe that the passenger-first framework in our scenario will be able to combine marketability, ethicality, and rational business decision-making, as well as legality, in order to make a safer future for our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's adjust our 20 minutes. Thank you very much. As a member of the board, I want to play devil's advocate for a minute because we deal with so many consumer groups and so many advocates, and we are so concerned about reputation, of course. As a business person, I'm not interested in ethical frameworks. I'm interested in ethics, but not ethical frameworks. So speaking outside the framework and speaking just directly about ethics, if you could respond to the question, what I know of ethics is not great, but I know do no harm is the sort of mandate for a number of medical and other professions. So I'm concerned about how you arrive at something that is ethical because it is so marketable. When we will need to be able to respond to consumer groups and others and mothers who have lost their children to driving accidents as pedestrians. I just want to know what thought you have on that and how you would make a defense for the position that you have in those terms.
So I think the first point to acknowledge would be that an accident such as one that you're suggesting or that we devise in our scenario before is incredibly unlikely with the advent of a self-driving car. And we believe that the societal benefits are abundantly clear. What we would say, in the event that there is a tragedy such as you were saying, where a pedestrian would unfortunately get hit, we can point to the fact that under our assumptions, the car is operating flawlessly and within the law. So the car is first of all prioritizing the safety of its passenger, but the second most important thing to remember is that it is operating within the law, and so the vast majority of the time a car will be able to stop before it would unfortunately hit anybody, and nobody would get hurt at all, especially because it wouldn't be speeding and it wouldn't be have its eyes off the road. It has perfect reaction times. In the event of a tragedy where a car does get into your self-driving car does get into an unavoidable accident, as you mentioned, we believe that we have a PR team at Google, you have a PR team at Google, and it would be a tragedy, but I think we would be able to show, and of course we would mourn for the loss of life or injury, but we would be able to show the car itself was not at fault, and the societal benefits overall are saving 20,000 lives in the US alone every year.
Thank you.
So I'm still not clear what we're solving for. Is the purpose of this autonomous vehicle to eliminate accidents, or critically reduce accidents, or is it this is a new and great dandy type of car that consumers will love?
Yes, so that's actually one of the main reasons that we selected our framework, is because we want to make that distinction. This isn't a toy for millionaires. This isn't for people who are addicted to cutting edge technology. This is something that can change the entire fabric of society for the better if adopted on a massive scale. The self-driving cars will have the perfect decision-making capabilities, which means, as we mentioned before, that we can eliminate up to 93% of accidents. With the further advancement of technology, perhaps we can get closer and closer to 100% of accidents. So as we mentioned before, the scenario that we outlined was incredibly complex. It was very difficult to establish a scenario in which an accident would have been unavoidable, because if there were multiple self-driving cars, then both of the cars would have been able to react in time and everyone would have been equally spared. So not only does it dramatically increase safety, it can, as we mentioned, it will increase access to transportation to people who otherwise wouldn't have it, such as the disabled. There are currently transportation options for disabled people, but they're incredibly expensive. So it would increase transportation options for many people, and while simultaneously reducing the risk of driving.
So I'm just trying to think of how to phrase this. Speaking as the board, we're responsible for ultimately impacting the bottom line of our company. And how do we sell? How do we take the framework and sell it on a mass appeal level? You can't say it's okay that the little kid that ran in front of the car died, because ultimately we're working on a rural utilitarian, which I actually agree with. But how do we make that sell to consumers who will come back and say, yes, but if a kid runs in front of the road, they're not going to be protected at all. If the car decides that their life is worth less than the passenger, it's just as the board member, it's a really tough sell for me.
I understand that concern, and we absolutely discussed that throughout the frameworks of the negative PR that could result from a number of decisions that the car could make. what we believe is the strongest point of marketability is taking that safety and bringing it on an individual level for consumers. And so selling to the mass market overall societal benefits is of course very unrelatable and very impersonal. So we believe that the passenger first framework brings that onto an individual level, a common marketing strategy, if you will, bring that to an individual level to make it more relatable and to make it more attractive to consumers.
Do you want to ask a follow-up? Okay. Obviously, we're business people, and we are responsible for the company's leadership in pioneering a new technology. I find it odd, as someone who is focused on profits, to find myself coming back with you again on the ethics issue, because I think that this isn't a PR problem, ultimately. I think this is a human problem. And I think that our reputation as the kind of company and car company that you want to do business with is inherently connected to how we communicate, not again from a PR standpoint, but from a very authentic place. And I'm still troubled about the notion, and it may be that the answer that you gave in response to the question clears up better than some of the information that you have in the presentation regarding, if I understood you correctly, we are talking about unavoidable accidents. So the question becomes, how big a problem is unavoidable accidents? How many kids die a year because of accidents in which the driver is incapable of stopping?
So, in terms of children, we don't have those numbers. We know that there are over 23,000 fatalities in the US every year. Around the world, that number is actually 400,000. And the vast majority, I wouldn't say the vast majority, but I would say a plurality of those accidents, especially in the emerging world, are focused on young people. As a result,
whether they're on bikes or whether they're on anything.
Exactly.
Skateboards.
Exactly. And there's 400,000 accidents, and I would say a plurality. It's a large number of them are children who are being hit by humans who don't have the reaction capacity to brake in time, or texting, or talking or singing their songs while rather than being entirely focused on the road. So the self-driving car has we're offering a passenger first framework as a way to sell the car, because getting the car on the road is the way to save the lives of those children all over the world.
Furthermore, think of the children who are in the back of the car. Think of the mother with 3 kids on the way to school. The self-driving car has a responsibility to protect all of the passengers of the self-driving car.
Thank you. All right, anything else? Okay, we'll go into our feedback. I think you took on something fascinating and difficult. And I think you did a good job. But for the purposes of being a consultant, talking to a company, the whole focus on how you arrived at where you arrived, the ethical framework, is not something that would sell. In the sense that businesses don't talk that way to each other. They make decisions, and there can be enormous compassion and enormous thought that goes into something. And they may well say it's the right thing to do, but in my corporate capacities, when I have argued effectively, it hasn't been saying it's the right thing to do, because when I've been up against lawyers talking about lawsuits, That's not a language, not that lawyers are bad or anything else, but it's not, they're not, when we're slamming when we're slamming plaintiffs in order to minimize our liability, that's what lawyers are supposed to do to protect the company. People inside the company have a really different role, and talking about it's not right to be defaming so-and-so is not going to get a lawyer to listen. I just use that by frame of example. So I think you have a lot of strong arguments. I hope in your 10 minutes you do not discuss the utilitarian framework, because it will not help you in this particular contest, which has as a criteria that you're speaking language that business leaders would be using and understanding. It doesn't mean that you didn't arrive at a really effective way of positioning it. And if you were in a classroom, fabulous. But in your role, I think you need to really watch that. Other thoughts?
I agree. And I would speak to, first of all, let me start with the positive, because it's really difficult to take on a topic like this and be judged and have to think about presentation skills, my argument, my open, my close, and so I think you did a really good job in terms of being prepared, and obviously you put a lot of effort and time into this. I'll build off of what you're saying from a business perspective and talk more about the presentation piece of it. And I would encourage you to not be afraid to be yourself and let your natural personality come through around this, so that it's a little more conversational, and that it presents you in a way that you, in order for you to speak the language and for people to kind of understand where you're coming from, you have to allow yourself to show a little bit more. And I felt like at times I wasn't sure if you did a really, really good job memorizing the content versus researching and really throwing yourself into it and taking on this role, this concept, this idea, this topic, etc. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
And I wanted to say that I think in terms of structuring the argument, sort of doing what economists do really well, and living with the assumption, sort of the ceteris paribus way of saying all these other things aside, and there's perfect technology and all this, it's really helped to keep us focused on the task at hand. I would say though, especially given what I asked in the Q&A, it goes back to what you were saying. It's not enough to say doing the right thing. Think about the sort of the next level questions that you're going to get. How do we sell this? How do we combat the headline, Google doesn't care about your children, for example? To go to a really bad case that could happen, reality says, on one hand, that's not a terribly fair thing to accuse, but on the other hand, that's sort of the reality, especially with this new technology that people do fear. That's the kind of things that are going to come up. So if there's a way that you can speak to, if we're really executive, we're thinking of a business case, mm-hmm. Sort of, what is the value of approaching this? Think about things that we can grab onto that are a little more practical than ultimately it's the right thing to do, I think.
I think that's a good point you said, the business case, because I'm not really sure the business case was evident.
Well, what I got for the business case was the marketability of the car, and that you have to have somebody. What I got, the more you did a wonderful job in the Q&A. It isn't to say that your presentation wasn't good, but the pieces of it that bothered me from what the role is we have to play in helping support you make the best possible ethics argument. Your answers in the Q&A gave me what was bothering me in the presentation. It's almost, and again, it's not PR, but when you start with the notion that inevitably, the way we're currently driving, no matter how safe manufacturers try to be in their cars, we are losing unnecessarily children, bikers, adults. We're losing people through driver error. Driver error is not something, unfortunately, that we can train out of people. It is a reality of being a human being. This amazing technology takes away the senseless, meaningless deaths that are automatically occurring because we can't do a better job of seeing everything we need to see. I think then you indicate the reality is there will still be 7% of the accidents that are going to occur. They're going to be the accidents that we couldn't stop anyway. And it's tragic. There will still be people dying. But there will be 93% people who could have been affected who won't be. That makes me feel that you're being responsive and you're not just being driven about who's going to buy the car. Because obviously car makers care, but your point about how do you respond, they get killed by the activists, the parents, the crying mothers to the media, the crying fathers, and our own crying when we know someone who's been affected by that. It's a highly emotional, personal issue, and I think your point's a really good one. Because it's such a personal issue, you showing up personally is really, really important too, because that helps sell here I'm using words that I didn't want to use, but the reality is it helps persuade. You did a wonderful job, and I think if you're freed from the framework, you have the ability to talk business sense, but also then tie it back to the human aspect. Because I thought you were fabulous starting with the trolley, and then I thought about, you know, these are it suggests that you could save someone and you choose not to. But what you're saying is you can't save them. And if that's true, don't show I mean, you're not showing anything tomorrow with the 10-minute, but you set me up for thinking that there's choice here. And I think what you're really saying in the business case, there's no choice. But the car has to be programmed, you know, if I'm understanding you correctly, the car can't be programmed to save, I guess the car could be programmed to save pedestrians.
It could, but
Could be at the expense of the passengers or the party that is causing the accident, because if there's an accident in the first place, it can't be the car.
would you buy a car that you thought was going to sacrifice you to save someone who ran in front of you, who was jaywalking, you know, stuff?
You need to be careful with that.
Right,
Yeah,
of course.
It's a very fine line.
Yeah.
But
Right, sure.
But I think, I mean, you picked a really, I can hear Congress debating this, you know, for the next 75 years. Only if we're lucky, otherwise it's 120 years. But you did a really nice job. Any other feedback that you want to give them for tomorrow for their 10-minute?
I would just say to really get focused and you got really good feedback here, and to take that and help you just kind of refocus and get really centered and clear for tomorrow.
Great. Do you have any questions of us?
So I was going to ask, so you think it's valuable to, we tried to bring it more abstract, but the case that you laid out just before, which I think is really powerful, was to almost put an emotional appeal and say why this is a necessary business. This is Google's responsibility, duty to do it in order to save things. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I'm not thinking that you pull heartstrings.
Okay.
But I'm thinking that what you have apparently, and you both need to weigh in. What you have is when you're talking abstract, when you're talking in the big picture of saving 93%, but then we're still struggling with the kids on the side of the road. Your mind goes to the kids on the side of the road, and the piece of it that I think you're trying to say is that in most cases, to program the car to deal with the extraneous, not extraneous, but to deal with the out of ordinary situations that result in accidents because of a mistake on the part of the pedestrian is a thing, which you're essentially saying. Although would you, if a biker was on the road, would you be hitting the biker versus the passenger if the biker was doing what the biker was supposed to do? If the biker was claiming his or her part of the road, you wouldn't be needlessly hitting the biker.
That's
right?
where our assumption is that the car has perfect technology, and so it would abide by the law and therefore
So to talk about the number of accidents that happen because the car does not have perfect technology and innocent people are being affected is a very different argument than, I think, who do you save?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I think balance is important, right? It's very difficult to talk about a very emotional topic with no emotion.
Yeah, sure.
So I think balance. You definitely want to have an emotional appeal because it's just obviously a very emotional topic. You want to have a strong business case. At the end, me personally, I just felt like it wasn't real clear and real evident to me. I could cite different things, but it just wasn't real powerful. So a really strong, solid business case, definitely a balance between emotion, practicality, and, I think what you said, there's some elements of this that you just can't argue, and so therefore don't argue them, but just present them so that, people have the balanced kind of big picture of the whole thing. And I want to add one piece, and I'm torn to even add it because it could, I don't mean to be nitpicky, and I'll say it in a general, when you're ending your piece of the presentation, don't drop off. Stay strong. So you started out with a very kind of confident position of what you were going to say. At the end strong. Don't drop off. Don't talk in a questioning tone. You know how you kind of dip up and it's almost like a question, because then it's like you lose your confidence and you lose your confidence, let me just say that. And then for me, listening, I'm not sure if you're questioning yourself, if you're questioning your content. I don't know what's going on. I'm not sure. And so therefore my attention goes to what's happening with you. And so just start strong, end strong.
You covered a lot of this. I just think, to get back to the word use emotional appeal, just remember that, businesses unfortunately can't respond with emotional appeal. So it's important to recognize the limits of how the emotions can be. So you can use it to sell a position, but then when you have to think about how the business will actually respond and continue to make profit, they have to go about it in a very different way. So bring both of those pieces together. And it's not easy to do, but that's the reality of when you're speaking to the business crowd, and you have to not just convince them of the position, but also we need to give you the tools in order to be successful in this position. There's the bigger piece of that is really the practical part.
Yeah.
I have one final question for you guys. Do you think it was effective at all that we mentioned some of the more kind of happy benefits of self-driving cars, like increasing access to transportation for disabled people, and kind of, for a second stepping away from the death subject? Or do you think because we framed it as an answer to a crisis, that we should just stick with that one argument? Interesting. What do you both think?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that because it shows other alternatives. I mean other benefits, rather. Yeah. And so for me personally, I like benefits. I like options.
Do you? Actually, what I thought was really effective was the example of the vaccinations, which have a similar life and death effect, truly. And you brought up the fact that there was an act passed that changed the liability scheme, and that's something businesses can latch onto and actually lobby for, and is very helpful in getting companies into the industry and making things ultimately better for everyone. That was a really good thing, I thought, because that's a tangible example of a past problem that's been solved.
Great. I didn't even remember hearing the example about the disabled. The vaccination I did, but
I remember that.
I was discussing it in the business aspect about how is it an expansion to new market segments, because people who previously didn't have the capacity to drive now have the potential to buy a self-driving vehicle.
and my mind was focused on the whole, when somebody gets caught in the context of saving some, not saving others.
Yeah.
They end up screening out other information. But,
Sure.
but the vaccination, I think, is a great example. So, and that, I mean, to your point, it is a benefit. You've got 10 minutes to condense 30. And so thinking carefully about how you position it definitely should include other things. I think for me, the ending needs to be a compelling way of restating why this needs to be done.
Yeah.
One way to have a happy ending is to go back to the trolley and make it a self-driving trolley and extend the track back 500 feet and say, our trolley would never have gotten into that to some point.
That's great.
Yeah.
Only they can use snorkel.
Yeah, that's true.
The next provides the handout.
But you really, the amount of work that you all put in, when did you start preparing for this? And you're not allowed to say freshman year, because I won't.
We would talk about the case competition since October. I think it was December, January, we really
And we
put out to the matter.
formulated the same argument that we've been working on.
And it's funny because our argument actually changed the more time that we put into it. So it
Where
was
did you
kind of
start?
a process getting to our conclusion.
We started with the first framework of minimizing casualties or minimizing harm to all parties involved, treating all lives equally.
It's kind of a general, as we said, with the act utilitarian approach,
Yes.
and then it's exactly what we said. We mirrored our own thought process in the presentation. We took a step back from the individual case-by-case basis instead of saying, are we going to kill the 2 kids or the 2 adults, 2 kids or 2 elderly people, 3 cyclists, 5 pedestrians, instead of
You on Prozac while you were doing that?
we should have been. So that's how we had to take the step back and say, how are we actually going to help society? We can never get past this individual scenario if someone's not going to buy the car because they're afraid it's going to sacrifice them.
And that's where ultimately the ethical framework is brilliant in helping you arrive at that place. It isn't necessarily useful in explaining it to people who don't think that way.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's fair.
Yeah.
But
Tomorrow we definitely won't. We'll definitely be out there. Yeah.
nice job.
Thank you very much.